Hello, everybody, and welcome to Confrontational Histories, the YouTube channel that takes on bad historical myths and narratives. This video is something of a follow up to my prior video on traditional Catholicism and sort of wild conspiracy theories. But I do feel like there's a lot more to say about this whole thing around traditional Catholicism, tradcaths, and where their views come from, and the history of the church and the sort of context that the church exists now, and also just kind of traditionalism and society at large. And so that's what this video is going to be about. And to start off on this, I'm going to talk a little bit about the movie Conclave. Now, I'm not bringing this up to talk about the surprise twist at the end or anything else like that, the reaction to it. The reason I want to bring this up is because I was watching a interview with the director, and he made a point that I thought was really, really interesting. There's a character in the story named Cardinal Tedesco, and he is intended to sort of represent the traditionalist Catholic viewpoint in the film. And the thing about Tedesco is that despite his ultra-traditionalist views, he is very modern looking in his presentation. Even his traditional vestments seem to have sort of a modern flair to them. He's got that sort of retro modern aesthetic with his hair and with his beard and with his glasses, kind of like a very debate bro type of look, and he even uses a vape. Now, when I was watching the movie, I'd kind of clocked this as intending to mean something. But when I was watching an interview with the director said something incredibly interesting, and I thought it was such a wonderful way of framing the sort of larger point here, which is that while Tedesco and people like Tedesco frame their views as being of tradition, in reality, everything that they believe is incredibly modern because it comes from modern preconceptions of the culture wars, not anything that is traditional to Catholic teaching or to societal norm. And in thinking about this point, I was kind of able to link it to something that I have thought of a lot in the past, which is that in observations of people I know and observations of even some of my own family members, I look at them and I see that their worldview, their traditionalism, does not stem from love of the past, love of the culture that's been handed down to us, so much as it really stems from hatred of the world as it is. And therefore, when they do try to talk about how they hate this modernism and they love traditionalism, it's not coming from a place that actually tries to understand the tradition. It always comes from a place that is trying to set up an ideal that they want to impose upon everybody else. I don't think that it is in any way coincidental that there's been some good research that's been done on this topic. If someone has a particularly strong disgust reaction, they are more likely to hold conservative views or have other personality markers that tend to be correlated with conservatism. And I want to point out that I'm saying this within the vein of the fact that there are a lot of people out there who, because of the complexity, I might say stupidity at times, of modern politics, are fairly conservative on all but a few issues, but because of those few issues, they get to define themselves as liberals. It's kind of the paradox of conservatism and traditionalism is that even more than any other ideological perspective, it's purely defined by time and place. But historically speaking, disgust towards the world the way it is has not been the traditional Catholic perspective on a lot of things. If you go back through the history of the church, now granted there have been progressive times in the history of the church, there have been conservative times in the history of the church, these things do ebb and flow. There have been introspective times, and there have been more outwardly looking times. ebbs and flows. But historically, the position of the church has been to be a part of the world. Especially if you go back to times before modernity, not being a part of the world was tremendously difficult because of how dependent everybody was upon each other. But the church's historical stance has been to engage with the world as it is, and to be out there, and to, as Pope Francis would say, be a dirty church, a church on the streets, not to react with such innate disgust and moral rigidity, not to try to pound everything into the mold that they were trying to set, but rather to reach people where they were at. A really good example of this. So there was a Pope, Nicholas I. He was a pope in the 9th century, sometimes called Nicholas the Great. And there was a problem that came up because they were trying to convert the Bulgars to Christianity in Bulgaria. And the question came up about women wearing pants. See, because in the culture of Bulgaria, it was traditional for women to wear pants. But 1 Timothy, Paul says that a woman shall not wear pants, and also prescribes all of these different things that women should not do and should not be allowed to do. Now, these prescriptions have spawned a lot of theological debate over the years, including a lot of the textual critics who say, well, this isn't actually Paul who wrote this at all. This was a figure called Pseudo-Paul. There may have been more than one figure called Pseudo-Paul, but someone who may have known Paul, but clearly is not writing in Paul's style, and occasionally says things that are contradictory to what Paul says in what are believed to be the authentic Pauline letters. Dr. Barterman talks a lot about this. Go to him. I'm not an expert. But the point of this is that Nicholas was asked this question: should women be allowed to wear pants? Is this going to be a hindrance? And the response that he came up with is, and I quote, "For whether you or your women wear pants or do not wear pants, neither impedes your salvation, nor does it lead to any increase in virtue." In other words, this does not matter. It doesn't matter. Because, as Nicholas points out later, sometimes when people quote it, they end it there, and they kind of try to make this look like it was just some sort of flippant remark. But in reality, he goes on to say that the real issue at stake here is temperance. And so if it is within the cultural tradition of the Bulgars for women to wear pants, then that's fine. It does not matter. When these words of Pseudo-Paul and Timothy were first being written, a lot of men didn't even wear pants. Because a lot of men were wearing tunics or togas or what have you. And that's kind of, this whole thing was written in a different cultural context. And so these questions about, what is appropriate and what is not appropriate was all written within that context. So, and it's important to understand that even when you go all the way back to the Gospels, even when you go all the way back to Paul's letters, which were written prior to the Gospels, people's heads explode when you think about that, because they come after the Gospels, and of course, Paul comes after the life of Jesus. But Paul's letters were all written before confused myself there, before the Gospels were written. But each of those books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were all written to a particular social and temporal context when they were written. Traditionalists, both Catholic and Protestant, love to smash all of these things together, all four of these books together, and act like they're telling one coherent story. But if you read the four Gospels individually, you can very easily see that each of these books has a different perspective, a different point of view, and a completely different message that they're trying to get across. And in some places they contradict, and that's okay, because each one was being written to a different audience. And they were trying to convey what they saw as an important aspect of the teachings and life of Jesus of Nazareth. And I'm not even going to get into the debates over whether Jesus was a historical figure or not, other than to say that it is the overwhelming consensus amongst historians, amongst textual critics, amongst sociologists, amongst archaeologists, that Jesus of Nazareth was a real person. You don't have to believe in all the miracles, you don't have to believe in any of that, but because of what we know, how the spread of Christianity happened, everything else like that, it's an almost certainty that Jesus was a real person. Doesn't mean he was God. It doesn't mean that he performed any miracles, but at the very least, it's very likely that he actually existed. Okay, so to kind of explain my point here, one of the central theses of this channel, and one of the central theses that I always try to live my life by, and sort of that informs my worldview, is that everything derives from a context. And if you want to change the conversation, then you have to change the context of that conversation. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk about 4 different points in the history of the church and sort of larger European society that define not only what the church has become, but also sort of define the worldview of traditionalist Catholics. We're looking at the timeline here, and in order to talk about this, we're going to undergo some major timeline compression, which is a big no-no for me. I hate it when people do that. I think it really distorts the views of folks about history and society and stuff like that. But I'm going to do this in a way that provides the context for everything. So trying not to be a hypocrite here. But the first major event that we have is the Gregorian Reform period. Now, this is named after Pope Gregory VII, but it's kind of started before him and continues on after him. But the Gregorian Reform period was a reaction to what's called the Age of Iron, or the pornocracy, to more colorfully put it, as some authors from around that time period have. This was a very dark time in the institutions of the church, although there were some decent popes, great popes actually came out of it. Nicholas I the Great, for instance. The Age of Iron, the pornocracy, is that's the period where the cadaver synod happened, if you've heard of that. It's when you had young popes who were literally found murdered in their bed with their mistresses. This was an outgrowth of the secular control that the church had grown into in the 2 centuries prior. So Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory the Great, Gregory I, he was sort of the first pope who interposed the church to take over the mechanisms of Roman civic government. Now, prior to him, Leo the Great, Leo I, he had stepped in to confront Attila the Hun and prevent him from burning Rome. The reason Leo had done that was because civil authority in Rome itself had collapsed. There was no one there to negotiate on behalf of the city, and so he went out of his own accord. Well, in the time period between Leo and Gregory the Great, things had gotten a lot worse. And so Gregory stepped up, and he put the church into this role of the government, essentially, made them the government of Rome. And that was fine for a time, but obviously having that temporal authority corrupted the church, and a lot of prominent families in Rome were battling over the church, and they were using church resources. Things became very corrupt, very impure, and very ostentatious. So, as I'd said, there had been some effort from other popes before Gregory to address this, but Gregory the Seventh, I should say, Gregory the Seventh really kicked into high gear this effort to reform the church. And so some of these reforms that he brought in were instituting clerical celibacy. His model was the monasticism that he had come from. He was a monk prior to this. And so he looked at monasticism and said, well, what does monasticism have going for it? This is prior to the problems that came up later in the Middle Ages with a lot of these monasteries. But, in the context of the 1050s and the 1060s, what does monasticism have going for it that we don't see within the secular church? And so he instituted celibacy. No longer as an option. In some places, it was an option. In some places, being married and being a priest is just allowed. It's not an option anymore. It's not a recommendation. You have to do it. He stripped out a lot of the more ostentatious, parts of church celebration, of the ceremony, the fancy dress. Again, a lot of these things that a lot of trad Catholics love. They love the bejeweled and everything else like that. He said, enough of that. We're throwing it out. Got rid of a lot of the gold and the silver and everything else like that was adorning these churches. Disgusting signs of wealth, give it to the poor. We're getting rid of this. Gregorian chant actually does not originally stem from him, but he certainly promoted it very strongly. Sort of plain song above these great, I was going to say Baroque, but we're going to get into the Baroque later. But these kind of very overgrown chants and ceremonies and stuff like that. Simplified everything. His reforms were then codified by the Second Lateran Council. Now, what's the Lateran Council? So the Second Lateran Council was one of the most important church councils for the Western Church. As I said, its main job, or the main thing that it did rather, was it codified a lot of these reforms. But it was called because Gregory's reforms had caused a great deal of controversy within the church. So there had been a schism within the church where you had some people supporting who we now see as the legitimate pope, and we had some people who were supporting an anti-pope. And the anti-pope's platform, essentially, was support of lay investiture, so kings and emperors have a right to invest bishops, not the pope. And that was one of the great battles that Gregory had fought with the Holy Roman emperors. And presumably, or at least ostensibly had won it for some time. But, these ideas never go away, and of course, it came back a few centuries after the Lateran Council. But this lay investiture, this not allowing priests to marry, this attempt to institute this monastic lifestyle, a lot of people weren't going for it. And so this anti-pope had a lot of support. And so the Second Lateran Council was called to remedy this and to also reinforce and codify a lot of Gregory's reforms. After the Second Lateran Council, although we're not sure exactly how long after that, the Lateran Council was about 80 years after Gregory had passed away, by the way, Gregory the Seventh. So after the Second Lateran Council, we have this other major thing that happens, and it's incredibly important. So we have something that comes out, a document that's called the Concordance of Discordant Canons. It's oftentimes mercifully called Gratian's Decretum. Gratian was he was a canon lawyer and a scholar in sometime roughly in the mid-1100s. We don't know exactly when, as I said. Gratian, under the direction of church authorities, of course, took an entire millennium of church teaching and put it into one single document. This is a document that we now call Gratian's Decretum. But by doing this, he essentially reinterpreted 1,000 years of church history and reinterpreted it through the lens of this Gregorian reform. And so everything that we think about, or like the traditionalist Catholics think about the traditional church teaching on clerical celibacy, traditional church teaching on the authority of the Pope, even some of the traditional moral teachings, although canon law doesn't always really concern itself with the moral teachings. It's oftentimes more about the other stuff. But it's not really what was taught in the first millennium. Now, it's based off of some of the teachings in the first millennium, but it's reinterpreted through this Gregorian reform lens. And, as the name says, it is discordant canon. So they took canon, they took all of this teaching that was discordant and they made it cordant, for lack of a better word. But within that is the acknowledgement that all of these great church fathers and popes and canon lawyers before this, what they were teaching and what they were saying did not match up with each other, certainly not in a nice, neat little way. And so to get there, we had to chop off a lot of the bits that the people who were assembling this in the 12th century, the bits that they didn't like and did not conform with the narrative that they wanted to push. So again, that context. So from there, we move on to the Council of Trent. And I brought up Trent last time. Trent is where a lot of the practice that traditionalist Catholics, a lot of what we think of as traditional Catholic practice, that's where it comes from. It's also where the canon of the Bible, the Catholic Bible, was finally sealed once and for all, but not in Dan Brown's imagination, but that's where it was in reality. But that's where the Tridentine Mass comes from. That is when a lot of these, or it didn't come from that, it came later, but it came out of desire to regularize the ordinances of the church. And so, in order to do that, they had to suppress the Gallican Rite, they had to suppress the Sarum Rite, they had to suppress the Mozarab Rite, and replace them with this Tridentine Mass. It doesn't go back all the way to the beginning of whenever, that goes back to the Council of Trent. And so the Gregorian reform is where traditional views, the traditionalist ideal of the canon of the church comes from. And the Council of Trent is where the traditionalist view of the practice of the church comes from. So that leaves two remaining things that I wanted to talk about, two remaining milestones. So the first of those is the Holy Wars of the 17th century. I brought this up before in my lectures. A lot of what the people in the Enlightenment, and then people in the Victorian era, and then people today think about what medieval society was like, what medieval religiosity was like, actually stems from the 17th century and the 30 Years' War and the Reformation. It doesn't have anything to do with Catholicism or Christian practice that came before that in Western Europe. Before this had all happened, Catholicism was essentially the only game in town. And when you're the only game in town, you don't have to feel threatened by every heresy that comes up. You don't have to feel threatened by every single little bit of deviancy that comes up. The focus of the church was a lot more on pastoral care. They weren't always great at it. And I want to point out, there were some atrocities during this period. Do not get me wrong. If you look at the persecutions and the expulsion of Jews throughout Europe, but especially the expulsion of Jews from England, it's some terrible stuff. And if you want to do some research into that, it's not great. But for the most part, these kind of like witch hunts and massive persecutions and things like that just were not as common during the Middle Ages. And science was also fairly well embraced during the Middle Ages. They didn't have all the tools to understand everything, but monasteries were doing an awful lot of science, and it wasn't seen as the work of the devil. If you could come up with a new mathematical thesis in the Middle Ages, you were praised, you weren't burned at the stake. Wasn't until the wars of the 17th century that everything became a whole lot less tolerant. And a lot of that has to do, of course, with the fact that all of these religions in Europe now feel more threatened. They feel more vulnerable. They feel less secure. But also, even though Catholicism it maintained itself as something of an antithesis to this notion that the only thing that matters is your personal holiness and purity and your personal relationship with God. It was still existing in this context at this time, and the overall religious picture in Europe could not help but to affect Catholicism. And so that certainly did have an impact. We shift from a paradigm in the Middle Ages where the focus of Catholicism is mainly on care for people in the outside world, to the focus of Catholicism primarily being social control. And that changes a lot about the way that the church operates. No longer are we engaging with the world as it is. Now we are trying to shape the world as it needs to be, because we never know if there's a Calvinist monarch, a secret Calvinist pretender to the throne hanging around who might threaten everything that we believe and stand for. So Catholicism changes as a result. And again, it's this moral rigor that traditionalist Catholics say is an important part of the Catholic tradition only goes back to about this period. And then finally, you have the prisoner of the Vatican era. Now, what am I talking about with that? Well, so Italian reunification happens starting in the 1860s. And part of Italian reunification was the removal of the papal states from the control of the Pope. The Pope at the time was Pius IX. Pius had actually come in as a reformer. He had come in as someone who professed to be a progressive, but then soon became an arch-conservative because the papal states were taken away from the Pope. The Pope was allowed to keep the Vatican. The Vatican was actually not as central to the papacy before this period as it is now. Now the Vatican is everything. Prior to that, it was not seen as being synonymous with the papacy because the Pope had lots of palaces, and the Lateran Basilica is actually where that's the cathedral church of the Pope in Rome. But the Italian government did not say that the Pope could only stay in the Vatican. The Italian government was very clear. We are giving you these territories. You can still keep them. You can keep the Vatican. You can keep some of your palaces throughout Rome. It's fine. And you have free movement wherever you want to. However, Pius adopted this attitude that he was now a prisoner of the Vatican. He would not accept the legitimacy of the Italian government's rule over the former papal states. And so he locked himself into the Vatican and really played up that, we're this enclave, we're under siege. And so this is where the church under siege becomes the main ethos of the church. So first, the church's ethos is shaped by the Holy Wars, and then the ethos is shaped by this idea of the church under siege. And it's not that popes did not attempt to engage with the wider world during this period. Certainly Leo XIII did, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. But it created this mentality within the church that holiness is found here. This is the most holy spot on the earth here in the Vatican. And this is our church and our Pope who is under siege from these secular forces. And therefore, what is the outside world, no longer do we engage with the outside world as it is. The outside world is evil. And holiness is found here and only occasionally found outside of these walls. So, again, that's where those three things, or those four things rather, you can see where, the traditional canon, traditional quotation marks, the traditional canon of the church, the traditional ideal of the celebration of the church, and now the least traditional, because it is the most modern, the traditional ethos comes from within Catholicism, and as I said, also within broader society at large, but the focus of this is on Catholicism. So we're going to talk about this point and extend this out a lot more here in a bit. But look where we've come from. And look at how, as I said, all of this, you can kind of see how all of this informs a lot of these things that these tradcaths say, and why they now, they use this excuse of one unchanging church going all the way back to the beginning of time. So now that we've established that context under which the church currently operates, I want to talk a little bit about something that I had teased out before when talking about the prisoner of the Vatican era. And that is attempts during this period to engage with modern society. Pope Leo XIII currently holds the record, if you will, for having been the Pope who wrote the most papal encyclicals. An encyclical is a sort of long-form opinion that a Pope has about an issue of the day, citing Catholic tradition and scriptures and everything else that can go into that sort of thing. But one of the encyclicals that he authored was called Rerum Novarum. Literally translates to on new things in English. Pope Leo XIII was the inspiration for the current Pope Leo XIV, who seems to want to follow in Leo XIII's footsteps. And also, you may hear my fan going in the background now. We are in the third or fourth day of a monstrous heat wave here in Pittsburgh and across the Midwest. So if I don't have my fan going, I am going to die. And so I hope you'll forgive that. So back to talking about Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum has gotten a lot more attention recently, both because it's an important inspiration to the current Pope Leo XIV, and really has been an inspiration to all popes. Many popes have built on Rerum Novarum for their social justice teaching. But also, as I say that, because it is foundational to modern Catholic social justice teaching. It is pointed to oftentimes as the foundational document. Certainly foundational to me. I first read it about 25 years ago, and since then it's been a core touchstone for me for how I view social justice and for my own politics and my own religious beliefs. And certainly being a traditionalist and a conservative, if you read Rerum Novarum in a certain way, in a certain modern context, it sounds like it supports a lot of your beliefs. I certainly believe that whenever I first read it many, many years ago, and myself identified as a conservative. In it, Leo does condemn socialism directly, but he also condemns capitalism and laissez-faire economic systems. In it, Leo makes a strong, impassioned case for something that sounds like the conservative concept of local control. It's something that he calls the principle of subsidiarity. Rerum Novarum defends private property rights. Leo also makes an impassioned argument for sort of the nuclear family, although that term didn't exist at the time, as the core structure of society. And he also advocates for a strict division of labor, with women being involved in domestic labor and men going out and working elsewhere. So all of that is in there. But again, context, context, context. Certainly, Leo does condemn socialism, but if you actually read it, it's very clear that his condemnation is geared towards a certain type of socialist outlook. It's Marxist atheistic dialectism, not just any type of socialism. Socialism has had a lot of different meanings since before Leo, and it had a lot of meanings after Leo wrote. And as a matter of fact, later, a lot of Catholic and Christian socialist movements, using Rerum Novarum as part of their inspiration, sprang up, and they got approval from the church. You look at the Catholic worker movement and a lot of other, that's just here in the United States, but a lot of the other movements, Catholic socialist movements around the world, they did this specifically with the endorsement of the Vatican and local Catholic hierarchies in a lot of situations. Leo also just as strongly condemns the idea that someone else should profit massively from another person's labor and thereby deprive the average person of the benefits of their work. And if you look at it, that type of capitalism, it was a fairly new institution throughout the world, and certainly was very new in Italy, which is where Leo was from and where the context that he grew up in. So prior to that period, economic and social power was not as concentrated. The factories were a lot smaller. Workers in general were taking home a larger share of the product of their work. This really, it's funny, this kind of aligns with the Marxist concept of alienation a lot, even though Leo was condemning Marxism in this encyclical. But, in terms of how capitalism evolved, this is a very strong condemnation of how things were evolving and how they continue to evolve. And as I said, centralization of that power was something that Leo was very, very strongly opposed to. That then gets into the conversation about subsidiarity. And a lot of people read this and they're like, well, that's just local control. That's not what Leo was saying. The principle of subsidiarity, matters of society, matters of the governance of society, should be conducted by the smallest competent authority. Competent is very important there. He's not saying that, well, we should just have like states' rights or whatever, and however people want to interpret this. He's also not saying that we should, have a vast suburbanization where people move out to little rich enclaves and then set up a government there that allows them to keep their tax dollars separated from the rest of society. We'll get into that in a second. But, that's not what he's talking about when he's talking about local control. The authority has to be competent in order to ensure distributive justice and justice at large. Distributive justice is an important principle for Leo. He didn't invent the term, but he certainly is one of the early adopters of the term. And distributive justice as a term makes an appearance in this encyclical. Leo was not leaving any ambiguity about what he was talking about with this. Leo is very clear that the state should not draw all resources into itself. The ruling class should not draw all resources into themselves. The economic elite should not draw all resources into themselves, and they should also provide for the needs of society and for those who are on the bottom rungs of society. Preferential option for the poor and for the vulnerable is something that is directly quotable from this encyclical, and something that Leo ties directly back to the history of the church, saying that the foundation of the church is, yes, the salvation of souls, yes, holiness, but also charity and care for those in need. And under these new social structures and these new economic structures, we need to make sure that we're doing that. And to close this off, the point about private property, Leo is very clear that what he is talking about here is the right of the poor and the working class to not be deprived of their own possessions and their own wealth. It's not some great call for privatization of utilities or whatever conservatives might read and think today. And again, reading all of this as a young self-identified conservative, you imagine that utopian capitalism would fall under these formulas, and it would fall under the private property protection, and it would fall under all of these other things. But as a lot of us now know, these laissez-faire economic policies, utopian capitalism doesn't really exist. Probably a more consequential and direct blow to a lot of American traditionalists and traditionalist Catholics are Leo's attacks against Americanism. Now, this isn't exactly found in Rerum Novarum. It's found more in some of his other works, and really this started all the way back with Pius IX. But when we're talking about Americanism, what Leo is talking about with that term is partly excessive ecumenism, but also what is deemed to be an excessive focus on individuality and individualism. Now, Leo was very clear that he was not opposed to individual liberty or to individual gain. We already talked about that. But going back to Rerum Novarum's point about distributive justice, we need to focus first on the needs of society, on the village, on the community. And in condemning excessive focus on individualism, he also condemned an excessive focus on individual holiness. He saw this as a Protestant imposition. And this is the way that, when we're talking about ecumenism, this is a way that, unfortunately, a lot of traditionalist Catholics are quite ecumenical with a lot of evangelicals. They see a lot of personal, political, and social alignment in that. But, Leo saw this as an imposition on the true faith. And he warned people that trying to up their own personal holiness score, if you will, at the expense of actually doing good in the world and doing good for other people around you, and for protecting the vulnerable, protecting the sick, protecting the poor, that was a great way to end yourself in the bad place. So, and again, traditionalists really care a lot about their own purity, and they don't really seem to care so much about what's going on in the streets. And then this goes hand in hand with Leo's condemnation of modernism and relativism. Now, a lot of people hear that. Oh, God, modernism and relativism. Well, those are the big demons of traditionalist Catholics. That's the thing that they're always going on and on about, right? But Leo did not use these terms in the way that modern traditionalists do. For modern traditionalists, any sort of tolerance or acceptance of people and practices that they don't like is bad, and that is relativism, that is modernism. In a lot of cases, it's one thing to accuse liberals and progressives of lacking moral clarity. I do that all the time. but saying that accepting people and protecting marginalized people and protecting the poor is relativism is absurd. because there's a moral principle that's at play there. The moral principle is to protect marginalized people. It's not an anything goes mentality, but that's how a lot of times traditionalists kind of envision their liberal progressive opponents, as believing that, oh, well, there is no moral principle, anything goes. And again, that's not how Leo was applying these things. For Leo, relativism means denying basic moral imperatives like protecting the weak, like protecting the poor, like protecting the marginalized, in favor of laissez-faire ideas, or trickle-down theory, or ethno-nationalism. All of these things were modernist and relativist ideas in Leo's head, and they continued to be so in the minds of future popes who would come after Leo. These were the innovations that he was, in a lot of cases, talking about. Now, of course, he's also talking about, people who want to radically alter the faith in ways that aren't scriptural. But in terms of how this applies to society, Leo is directly attacking a lot of the ideas that traditionalists and conservatives hold as sacrosanct, as that, and also, he's going after this notion with Americanism and also with modernism and relativism. He's going after the idea that might makes right. He's going after the notion that just because someone wins an election, that means that they have moral authority. And he directly attacks this kind of civic religion that is built around evangelical America, and that a lot of traditionalist Catholics have adopted as part of their beliefs. And so when you're actually correctly applying these ideas within the context of the time of modernism, of relativism, of traditionalism, as Leo intended them, and as church leaders of the past intended these things to be interpreted, what you really get is an idea of Catholicism that is in a direct affront to what a lot of modern traditionalists with their modern context believe, because the tradition of the church is to be humble, is to mingle with sinners, is to help out the marginalized and the oppressed in society. So it's the exact opposite of what a lot of traditionalists are trying to go for with their own beliefs. And I'm not saying that this is like a full-throated endorsement of every modern progressive social trend. Certainly the church still had its very strong condemnations of homosexuality. I don't think that Leo would mingle well in a modern pride parade. And of course, there's the issue of abortion, which is something I'm going to talk about here in a bit. But, it's when you take all of these things and look at them, it certainly is a condemnation of the attitude that is taken by a lot of modern traditionalists. But I would also be remiss if at this point I didn't mention how Leo's own background and the context that Leo was in the 19th century shaped some of the views that he had on some of the core principles that he talked about. And so I already talked about those kind of four major milestones of the church and how they shaped the church into something that today in the second millennium, at the end of the second millennium of the church, is different from what the church was during the first millennium. But Leo's background, he was a fairly wealthy patrician, and that had something of an impact, as well as having grown up in the 19th century, that had something of an impact on his own view of the concept of the family and the division of labor. Both the idea of the nuclear family, as we think of it right now, and as Leo wrote of it, and the idea of the division of labor are both very modern concepts if you're looking at the entire stretch of human history. And these are two things that traditionalists really hang their shingle on when they talk of their vision of society. Now, there's been a lot of work that shows that the nuclear family, as we think of it, the idea that the family had one head of household, that was the father, and you had the sort of paternalistic setup for how the family should work, how it should operate, with the father as the head, the mother, and then the children. That was essentially created during the industrial age, or at least that's when it was created en masse. You go back through history and you can see that for wealthier families, this was generally the family structure. And of course, the wealthier families, those are the stories that get passed down. Bit of an aside here, in a video I intend to make at some point, but the Industrial Revolution itself did not really do a lot for the mass of poor people. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of evidence that it immiserated the poor much more than it helped the poor. But what it did do was it lifted an awful lot of people who were sort of in the middle strata and the upper strata into an even higher strata. And then those were the people who survived, because during the industrial age, I'm not going to say for the first time in history, because there were a lot of rough periods in history, but for the first time in history, systematically, it was quite common for entire family lines to just get wiped out. And of course, those family lines that got wiped out tended to be on the poorer side, and so they're not as well reflected in the demographics, the demographic picture of what was going on through the 19th and the early 20th century. But as I said, that's a bit of an aside. The point is that the picture for the wealthy was very different from the picture for the poor. And the poor had all kinds of different family situations that weren't the nuclear family. And of course, the further back you go, until you get to very early human history, the poor are the vast majority of the poor, and the deprived are the vast majority of the population. And so you would have plenty of households where there was no father, where you would have maybe two sisters living together with their children, where you would have you would have many generations under one roof. It's only because of affluence that you're able to have these sort of separate households, where Gaius Julius Caesar may have had a nuclear family in his household with maybe like one parent living in the household with them. But that's because they could afford that. Marcus, no last name, living in the same period during the Roman Empire, probably had a much more fluid family situation under his roof. And so that's how it progressed for the majority of human history. It wasn't until the end of the industrial age when this sort of nuclear family concept became more common. And I can link some articles and studies here that demonstrate what I'm talking about. But then along with that, this idea of the division of labor, of the woman being relegated to domestic life, that really only becomes something that seems like a reality, I emphasize, like a reality for the majority of families in the mid-20th century. This is the thing, throughout the majority of human history, women in poor households worked outside of the household. Now, they didn't necessarily work in factories, they might have had domestic work, they may have worked as shop laborers, sort of in roles like that. But the further back you go, the more you see the woman of the household doing exactly the same work as the men of the household, because they had to all support the same trade. So whether you were farmers, whether you were butchers, whether you were whatever, the women were basically oftentimes doing exactly the same work as the men were. And so this idea of domestic bliss that's held up by traditionalists and traditionalist Catholics of, the division of labor and of the nuclear family, these concepts are pretty new in the entire history of humanity, and even this ideal just was not really part of life for most poorer families. It's interesting, when the 1970s come around and you get these women to work movements that are being led by middle class and upper middle class women. A lot of poorer women did not connect with these movements very well because they were like, what are you talking about? We've been working the entire time. Two things I wanted to point out as kind of asides to all of this are that, because I didn't mention this before, part of the reason that the nuclear family became such a big thing during the industrial age was because you had so much migration during the industrial age. A lot of large extended families were broken up by migration to factory towns, or in the United States, migration westward, or immigration from European countries into the United States. And so that's where you first start seeing the nuclear family take a lot more of a role in society. The other thing I wanted to point out, which is kind of funny, but tells you a lot, is that during the Middle Ages, mathematics was seen as a more feminine pastime because it was only engaged in by monks and also women shopkeepers who were keeping the books for their husbands. And so even the concept that we have that women are bad at math and math is really a men's thing is a fairly new one. But the last thing I want to say here is that Leo and popes who came after him, Pius X, Benedict XV, Pius XI, they all believed that women's work was work. Domestic labor was labor, and it should be compensated as such by a society. And so they weren't entirely hanging women out to dry, but this whole framework of viewing the world is incredibly modern, even by the going back to the standards of the 19th century. So that gets us to the conversation about abortion that I've already teased out a couple of times here. I'm going to do this part, just this next segment here, completely unscripted. Normally I have a pretty loose script construction for my videos. I'm more of an outliner than a scripter, and I'll only specifically write something out in particular if there's something that's particularly difficult, particular that I have to get through. But I want this next couple of minutes here, for everyone to know that I'm being as sincere as possible in what I'm saying here. And while I might say a couple of things that are going to sound a little irreverent, it's not because I don't take this seriously. I actually take this very seriously. It's because I'm still trying to entertain folks who are listening. But so some things I want to say right up front. I know an awful lot of people who have what I would call a consistent and holistic pro-life position. They are generally opposed to abortion, but they believe in supporting social programs. They are also opposed to the death penalty. They're opposed to war. They are for supporting women's health and funding for women's health programs. They support early childhood programs. They have the whole bag going on. And for me, I find that, I think it's a perfectly respectable position. If you have a moral qualm with abortion, but you support everything else, including, as I said, women's health, women's reproductive health, and other ways, then I think that's a perfectly respectable position. And as I said, I know plenty of people who hold that position. And so I'm trying not to paint with too broad of a brush here. I will also admit that to this day, abortion's a slightly difficult topic for me to engage in because, for the entire time period that I was growing up, it was, it's the great evil. And it wasn't until, probably about a decade or so, 15 years ago, where I was, sometime between a decade and 15 years ago, where I was like, you know what, I think I agree with the pro-choice people, the people who are fighting for abortion rights, more than I agree with the pro-life people and the people who are opposing abortion rights. And a lot of that was because, having conversations with people who are out there and who are fighting on the front lines of this, and who are really putting in the work. For a lot of them, like, they don't view the goal as being abortion. There's a sick caricature of this type of person who was created by Rush Limbaugh, and by people who align with that type of politics, that portrayed the pro-abortion people as, as though they like abortion, they think that's the goal. They want more abortions, and that's not the goal. I mean, a lot of these folks also, as I said, they support the women's health programs, they support the social programs, they support all that stuff. They recognize, however, that we live in a reality where women's access to those things is imperfect at best and blocked at worst. And it's blocked by a lot of the same people who are going out there and they're talking up how much they love life and how much they support life. Well, let me ask you something. If you love life so much, why do you hate everything? Going back to my earlier point about disgust and just hating the world being sort of a key component of what a lot of these traditionalists are for. It doesn't sound like a pro-life position to me, I have to say. And again, as I said, I know plenty of people who hold the anti-abortion position, but they also believe in all of the other stuff, and they fight for all the other stuff. But here's the thing about folks like that, is that they are spending their weekends at food pantries and at homeless shelters, whereas the other folks are spending their weekends harassing and terrified women outside of abortion clinics. So they're not the same. It's not the same mentality. There's clearly a difference here. And as I said, I personally have some discomfort around abortion, but I fully support activists in the field who are doing this work. And like, above all, I think it's just important that we support, women are in a position in our society where they have to deal with consequences more oftentimes than they're dishing out the consequences. And I think it's important to recognize that and support people who are trying to deal with that reality. You do that without paternalizing it or without infantilizing women. But I feel like this bizarre things happened in the manosphere recently, where to genuinely like women is seen by a lot of these like hardcore traditionalist straights as being a bad thing. I just feel like if you really care about people and you love them, then you're going to support them having choices in life, regardless of whether or not those choices are exactly what you would do. So, as I said, just wanted to get that out of the way right now. Or, really one more thing. I don't think it's a shame to have an abortion. I think it's a shame that we put people in that position as a society. And I don't just mean the position of having the abortion itself. I mean the position where you're scared, you're isolated, you have no resources, and so these are your options. And so if we did a better job as people of being people, we would go a lot more, and more importantly, recognizing that women are people, we would go a lot further toward solving this problem. If this were truly what the traditionalists, pro-lifers cared about. If we did all those things, we'd go a lot further towards solving this problem than by just banning abortions and shaming people. So, but to go from there, I'm going to whiplash everybody. In recent years, there have been some attempts to try to find some sort of support for abortion on demand in traditional church documents, in scripture, and it's just not really there. It's taking a lot of things out of context, because the context of the social context, the kind of social context that the writers were in during the time periods and in the places and at the times that the millennium plus time span that these books are being written, that just the context wasn't there. Those aren't the type of societies that they were. However, there's also just simply not a lot of overt references to anything involving pregnancy in any of the books of the Bible, outside of just mentioning specific pregnancies of named people. One of the references that we do get comes from Exodus 21. In Exodus 21, the crime for striking a woman and causing a woman to miscarry is noticeably less than the penalty for the crime of murder. However, to cause mortal harm to a woman in the commission of such an act carries the penalty of murder. And so they're very clear that the woman's life here is valued above the life of the fetus in this schema, because one's murder, the other is not, and to kill the woman is murder, and the other is not. Now, St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century, cited traditional Jewish practices, which is kind of interesting in and of itself to think that even in the 400s, a lot of early church fathers were still going back and referencing pre-Christian, or in some cases even post-Christ, post-Jesus, Christian Jewish practices in order to sort of form their opinions about things. But he cited traditional Jewish practices and stated that while in his opinion all abortion was sinful, it was not considered to be murder until the fetus was imbued with a soul, which should not happen until it was, quote, formed. You have this distinction between formed and unformed. I'll get back and talking a little bit about that in a moment. But for him, it's not a mortal sin before the fetus is unformed. Now, in Catholic talk, there's a strong distinction between sins. It's very real. And while venial sins are wrong, you only go straight to the bad place for having committed unrepentant mortal sins. To have those on your conscience. So there's a very important distinction there. Now, Augustine wasn't the last word of his time. There were other writers who disagreed with the arguments that he was making, and they said that any type of abortion was a mortal sin because it went against, quote, God's plan. Of course, if you're going to make this God's plan argument, that becomes a real chasm very quickly, because it is a very tricky ground to fight on. But Augustine was not the only big gun here, because he was joined by St. Jerome. And so of the early church fathers, you have two big guns on the side of abortion early term is not a mortal sin. And then you have two big guns on the other side who are St. Basil and St. John. I always mess this up. Chrysostom, I believe is how it's pronounced. But Saint Basil and Saint John, who are on the other side, and they say that it's all a mortal sin. But I two things here. So when they came up with the status of Doctor of the Church, Saint Augustine and Saint Jerome were automatic inductees, and Saint Basil and Saint John Chrysostom, they had to wait several centuries longer. And so for me, it's kind of like comparing the 5 immortals of the Baseball Hall of Fame to guys who got inducted later, but not being entirely serious here, so no one go after me for this. But so there are 4 doctors of the early church. They're split evenly on this. That's the important thing to remember. I think it's also interesting to note that I don't know if this would sway anyone's opinion, but St. John Chrysostom had a really unusual view on this. That I feel is kind of, if people were, it's very bizarre. And so he believes that contraception of any kind, including any sort of natural contraception, shall we say, because I don't want to get gross, and any sort of, wasting as the seed, as they would call it back then, was actually a graver sin than late-term abortion. And so he's really coming from an odd place here. But, no matter. The important thing is that you go to websites like Catholicism.com, where trad-caths like to hang out, or even some, more mainstream Catholics. They're not quoting St. Augustine for some reason, which is really odd considering that they quote him on so many other things. The American Conference of Bishops actually, in order to address this, because there were people who brought this to them, and they were like, but St. Augustine says that early term abortion is not a mortal sin. They actually discount St. Augustine entirely, using the wonderful tired old trope that St. Augustine was from a time period where they were too ignorant to understand the facts of life, and saying that his knowledge didn't compare to the modern knowledge of what we have because of modern science, and so he can't have an informed. And I mean, first of all, this isn't a science channel, but the traditionalists have no science to support their opinion of life at contraception, or a soul being imbued at contraception. But what this is a history channel, and this argument that people in the ancient world were strikingly ignorant about the world around them is BS. I have tackled this one before in my prior videos. They might have lacked, as I've said before in this video, they may have lacked the exact scientific knowledge about how things worked, but they knew what they were seeing a lot of times, even if they didn't exactly know how to interpret it. And I dare say that going all the way back to the early classical world, in the European context, in the Mediterranean context, they understood the causes of contraception and when that started. They knew that when a mommy gets together with the daddy, etc., 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 and they knew the act that caused the child and everything else like that. But getting beyond that and being a little bit more serious, they also knew better than modern people what a miscarriage looked like and what it looked like at different stages of development. And so, now, don't get me wrong, there are many women today have miscarried, many more than you would realize, many more than would talk about it. But it was both more common back in the Middle Ages than it is in the modern West. And also it's something that everyone, women, men, young, old, layperson, priest, monk, nun would have seen. And chances are that the local priest, monk, nun is also the only doctor in town. And so when they were saying this thing about formed and unformed, which eventually developed into the idea of quickening, which I'll get into here in a second. But when they were saying this thing about formed and unformed, they knew what they were talking about. It was an informed opinion, because they knew that, again, not to trivialize it, the clump of cells was not the same as a 7-month-old developed fetus. They knew these things better, I dare say, than a lot of modern priests do, because a lot of modern priests don't deal with this, medical professionals do. So as I said, you get a little bit later into the Middle Ages, and this idea of quickening starts to form. And so, in other words, quickening is this idea that once you can start to feel the fetus move, that is when the soul has been imparted. And that usually happens around, can be as early as 18 weeks, can be as early as 25 weeks, but usually it's about 20, 22 weeks. And so many in the church continued to maintain that abortion before that point, while not desirable, was not mortal sin. In fact, to quote Gratian's Decretum, which was the canon law, the basis of canon law up until 1917, you knew that was coming back, quote, "He, she is not a murderer who brings about abortion before the soul is in the body," end quote. We also have many copies of manuscripts from clergy members who were in good standing that contain information on potions to induce early abortions, and on procedures for medically necessary late-term abortions. And you can have your opinions that these clergy were sinful or they were unfaithful, but again, they weren't commonly viewed as such during their time period. And in fact, Hildegard van Bingen was made a doctor of the church by Benedict XVI, and she was one of the authors of these manuscripts. And so, rather extensive manuscript, as a matter of fact. And so, that's, you can have your opinion on that, but this is a doctor of the church who you're assailing here. So, if this is where we were at, if this is the actual traditional view of things, and how do we get where we're at right now? And as I said, Gratian's Decretum was the basis for canon law up until 1917. And in 1917, the 1917 Code of Canon Law came into being, and they changed everything on many issues, but particularly for our purposes on the issue of abortion. Suddenly, this distinction that had held for well over a millennium between the moral consequences of early and late-term abortion, suddenly this is wiped away, and in 1917 it all becomes mortal sin. Now, why did it change during the early industrial era when it had held out for so long? It's really hard to say. Although the winds of change really started coming in before that. In the 1860s, Pope Pius IX rescinded at that point, 4-century-old papal bull by Gregory XIV that reaffirmed the church's actual traditional teaching on abortion, that there were different moral consequences for different stages. I would venture to say that a lot of this had to do with the stuff that we talked about before, with the shift towards the nuclear family and this ideal division of labor. Again, those were both modernist impositions on traditional society. Pius IX went so far, Pius XI went so far later as to declare that, if a woman is in immediate danger for her life, to provide her with an abortion was a mortal sin. And so we have completely flipped the paradigm of what was actually traditional. And now we're in this point that we're at right now where the Catholic Church in Canada and the United States and in some parts of Latin America in particular, they're leaning in on these claims of persecution because governments are passing laws that say, like, look, if a woman's life is at stake and she comes to your hospital, we don't always get the choice of what hospital we get to go to, and she requests an abortion, one of the most difficult choices she is going to have to make in her life, then you have a legal obligation to save that woman's life. And they're claiming that this is persecution, and then they're using that claim and the high profile press and coverage from traditionalists and traditionalist Catholics to say that, well, the reason they're shutting down the social services for pregnant women, the reason they're shutting down the social services for children, the reason they're shutting down urban parishes that help poor people is because they're under attack from society because of all these legal lawsuits. Legal lawsuits, that's quite a turn of phrase, but you get what I'm saying. But my point in this video was not to conclude with some big smackdown on abortion particularly. That just happens to be one of the best examples of something that is fundamental to what traditionalists believe, and they believe very passionately in it. But like really, if you look at the history, it's quite modern, despite the fact that it's one of the tent poles for a lot of traditionalist Catholics. And to reiterate my earlier point, something I've learned with time is that you don't get very far by telling people that they ought to be ashamed of themselves. And I know I'm not always the perfect vessel for that, even in this video. Sometimes I get a little overly impassioned. But if you want to talk to people, you've got to be able to present old problems in a new light. And the church has done that quite frequently over its 2,000-year history. If you want to find traditionalism in the church, then really Vatican II is the thing that you should want. Because, part of the goal of Vatican II was to push back 1,400 years of overgrowth and get back to the church as it was in its early years. But the traditionalist doesn't really want that, is the problem. They want something that makes them feel anchored and safe, but also validates the feelings that they have of being different from the people that they look down upon, which is, in a lot of ways, why they always try to return to some sort of idealized recent past as opposed to looking at the distant past to get their viewpoints. But as always, my videos are out there to take a look at these sort of classical or traditional or popular narratives and fill in all the parts that they leave out to change the context of the conversation. And people can be acculturated into accepting new things. If that were not the case, then we wouldn't have forms of conservatism and traditionalism that are very different from each other depending upon time and place. One of the great ironies is, of course, that traditionalism is one of the most adaptive ideologies because, as I'd said, it's always looking back to the recent past and not to the distant past. So if you go out there, and I firmly believe this, if you go out there and you're willing to engage with people and you come with the understanding that not everybody out there has the same information and life experiences as you do, then you can change minds. And I hope that some of this information is helpful to folks. It's something unique that I can bring to the table because oftentimes a lot of people who are very familiar with church history are also very traditionalist in their perspective. And so, the fact that I'm able to, or they're thoroughly, completely analytical and academic. And I'm neither of those things. And so, I hope that this is helpful to some folks. Leave a like, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications. Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you very much and take care.